For political commentary, Neale Jones and Brigitte Morton. Kia ora koroa. Welcome both.
Kia ora.
Morena.
Brigitte Morton is a director with public and commercial law firm Franks Ogilvie and a former senior ministerial advisor for the previous National-led government, a National Party member, and also volunteers for the party's deputy leader during elections. Neale Jones was Chief of Staff to the then Labour leader Jacinda Ardern. Before that, the then Chief of Staff to the then leader Andrew Little. He is the director of public affairs firm Capital and currently providing PR support for Andrew Little's campaign for Mayor of Wellington on a voluntary basis. Right, the electricity reforms, light touch would be one way of putting it. Is it enough in the face of business closures and a cost of living crisis, Brigitte? Will the government have satisfied anyone other than perhaps the Jen Taylors whose share values went up in the wake of this announcement?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's due criticism for there not being a lot of short-term relief in the announcement. I think, many of us, and particularly those on fixed incomes, would have preferred to see some sort of short-term intervention that would have meant that their prices will come down before next winter. But unfortunately, we are looking at a structural issue in terms of these reforms and an investment issue. And I think they have pointed their reforms at the right places, making sure that we have got that backup facilities for when we've got dry years. And that's been reflected in some of the commentary as well, who have talked about the fact that actually, if you look out across the next sort of 5 to 10 years, this is actually where we will see the impact of the announcement from last week.
Well, the so-called firming, the backup supplies in dry years is one thing. The other is, two obvious questions. Why weren't the companies doing it anyway? They haven't been short of a profit or two over the past few years. And then second, whether the investment in new supply just for baseload is anything like sufficient. And the argument is, Brigitte, that the incentives are just not there to invest. Keep it tight and your profits stay up.
Yeah, I think that's a valid criticism. But of course, you've got to look at, all the factors about investment. If you can bring down some of the costs in terms of that investment, that does make that equation different. And looking wider, you've obviously got the significant RMA reforms that have particularly targeted renewable energy and alternative energy sources. And I think that actually changes that equation quite a lot in terms of whether or not these companies are going to invest.
Was that really a barrier in the past, Neale? I think you've got a disclosure to make at the outset.
So, my firm does some work for a major company in the industry, so these are all my own opinions. Look, I think what the government had to do here was show that they were taking meaningful action, either to bring prices down or at least look like they were doing something substantial. All these things we can talk about, all these measures, they all seem perfectly sensible. I don't think anyone reasonable has objected to them. The objection has been that it hasn't done enough. And so you've had Simon Bridges coming out from the Auckland Business Forum, you've had the EMA come out, you've had the major electricity users group come out, all very unhappy with it. And I think the problem the government's got is, while they're all sensible technical measures, it fails the test of delivering relief for consumers or looking like there's actually proper action happening. And the fact that Shane Jones has been so quiet, which is very uncharacteristic for Shane, says a lot about where that's going. I think the government's opened itself up politically for an election year, New Zealand First attacking National Enact over their failure to do anything meaningful on power. And I think if Labour decides they want to start talking about some policy and start talking about electricity, I think they have an opportunity there to cast the government as not having done enough, and even have to crack at New Zealand First and say, well, Shane talks a big game, but as long as he's with National Enact,
but what did Labour do? Labour had a fleshed policy 10 years ago, a fleshed-out policy for a single buyer. It had a majority government. It didn't do anything either.
No, Labour's very quiet on this, and I'm surprised how quiet they have been, given it's a core cost of living issue and it affects their union working class base with the deindustrialisation of New Zealand. I think Labour does need to start coming up with some ideas.
Why is it so quiet on it?
That's the question about everything, isn't it? The charitable answer is that they are sort of waiting for the government to trip itself up and they'll come out with a big bold agenda next year or later this year. I hope that's the answer, because I do think this is one of those core issues that Labour does need to have a story on, and right now I don't really know what Labour's story is.
Brigitte, what were they even wanting to achieve out of this, apart from the obvious let's have a review after the dry year crisis last year? Clearly the mounting voices of what you would think would be fairly friendly lobby groups, the likes of the Northern Business Organisation. You've got a former National Party leader in Simon Bridges with the Auckland Chamber. You've got the major energy users group themselves, great big industrial players. that pressure's been coming on, but not enough to tilt the balance here.
Yeah, I think the pressure from those groups has been consistent with what we're seeing from the business community over the last couple of years. And whilst we tend to think actually, business goes towards a sort of non-intervention, deregulation space, we've actually seen since COVID much more of business asking for government intervention. And that's been a really interesting, I think, space. And you look wider at the politics of the left versus right, that actually business may not be the sort of natural home of the centre-right always now. You can't expect them to come out and be like, actually, let the market get on with it. Just turning, though, to the second point Neale was talking about in terms of labour, I did see Megan Woods out there commenting on this. I think her words were sort of weak and short-sighted, but it gave a really indication of just where their lack of thinking, I think, is on this. Megan Woods was, of course, the minister responsible. She has a lot of knowledge on what is happening. And for her to sort of basically come out and say that the only things that the government should be doing differently was sort of small-scale projects like solar panels on roofs, I was really surprised that Labor, and I think this is reflected in Neale's comments, didn't come out with something much stronger and much more well-informed.
As we said, they had the proposal for single buyer. Just to remind people what that is, that means that a government agency or independent sort of agency would buy all the electricity supply from these big generators, and that would give the generators a guaranteed contract price and take away that inhibition of don't build more than you need in the moment. I've not heard anyone talking about that policy again out of Labor. Have you?
No, I mean, look, that was NZ Power. It was one of those policies which, whether it was good or not, it was announced during an election campaign where Labor suffered a catastrophic defeat. So I think it was just kind of put in the box of don't touch that again. And I haven't heard that raised again. But look, there is a lot of thinking going on within Labor about various different ideas on the electricity sector. I just think the time is running short for them to come up with something and announce it and look like it's going to have a meaningful impact, because the government, I think, here has failed on the politics.
Well, we await Shane Jones being allowed to speak once someone is preventing that at the moment. I think we have approached his office offering time on this program if he would like to come and talk about.
It'll be cabinet collective responsibility, but once it gets closer to the campaign, he can speak as a New Zealand first spokesperson.
How long does that have to hold?
You have to ask Shane, probably.
Okay, well, we're available now, Minister, anytime you want to come and talk about proposed electricity reforms. How not to build bipartisan consensus. Brigitte, what went on with this letter from the Prime Minister, was it, to Chris Hipkins about oil and gas, etc., and trying to build a bipartisan position that appeared to be in the hands of the media within about an hour, was it? What went on?
Yeah, I think there's a genuine attempt there to have some bipartisan support, because they know, because of the flip-flopping on the oil and gas exploration ban and the fact that it was completely, unsupported and did not have any evidence behind it when Labor announced it, that there is a real investor risk. And for them to succeed on this particular policy, they do need Labor to actually come to the table. What appears to have happened, though, is that hasn't flown through, or the intent hasn't flown through about how they would deal with that in the media and communications. And there's no doubt that was ham-fisted and clumsy last week, and disappointingly could put at risk the ability to actually get some real cut-through on this.
I don't think it was a good faith attempt at bipartisanship. I think if it's good faith attempt at bipartisanship, then you actually, well, first of all, they would have engaged with the process. Megan Woods had already written to Simon Watts, who had already replied 4 days earlier about working in a bipartisan manner. The Luxor letter seemed to be unaware of that. If it wasn't unaware of that, it was extremely ham-fisted, as you say. You also don't give it to a journalist so that the journalist is making calls to the leader's office before the leaders even had a chance to read the email. This struck me as Luxon looking to pin the blame for New Zealand's energy woes on Labor and on oil and gas, and make that a political story where Labor's on the back foot. It wasn't about bipartisanship, it was the opposite. And the ridiculous thing of it is that the oil and gas exploration, we haven't had a find in about 20 years. Even if we did somehow find oil and gas, you're looking another 10 years before it comes on stream. The idea that this is any kind of solution to New Zealand's energy woes in the short or medium term is just absurd. And
it's for firming. With the current kit we have, its primary role is for firming.
You're looking at a decade away at best. And the thing is, you look at how quickly technologies developing on renewables and battery storage and other things. The idea that in a climate crisis we should be putting all our hopes on finding oil and gas where we just don't find it.
All right, let's talk about the politics
it's just nonsense.
again. The fact that letter ended up in the hand of a journalist too quickly really suggests something about management, I guess, management of an issue. Just one final point on this. You had the CTU coming out proposing the renationalisation of the 3 mixed model big gentailers. Helpful or unhelpful for Labour, for one of its biggest supporters, whose chief economist is on the Labour Policy Council, to come out and do that?
Well, Craig's a friend of mine, so I'm not going to criticise him, but I think what I would say is he takes his job very seriously as the CTU economist, and that's the hat he was wearing. He's not. He doesn't mix those two things.
All right. Now let's have a look. The Te Pāti Māori internal difficulties continue, and that they are becoming public, Brigitte. And the particular issue they've got at the moment is the split of a or the risk of a split of a very, very significant movement in terms of the Toi Tū Te Tiriti split. 15,000, was it? More than that? No, it was way higher than that, marched on Parliament. And this is a big movement. And how worried will Te Pāti Māori be about a rift here?
Yeah, I think they'll be very worried, and I think you can see that coming through in the limited communications coming out. I think Neale and I are both pretty sympathetic to internal factions within political parties. I think every political party has been through tension and through strife like this. So I don't think this is uniquely a Te Pāti Māori issue, and also would be, cognizant with a party that is growing up. They have gone very quickly, I think, into this new kind of role and this new identity that they're having. But, ultimately, that is for Te Pāti Māori and Te Pāti Māori supporters to determine whether or not they are the right voice for them. It's an interesting factor for Labour, about whether or not they exploit this and show themselves to be the actual deliverers of outcomes for Māori rather than just rhetoric.
Tens of thousands, many tens of thousands, I think, was estimated to be the size of that march at the time, and a very sort of significant leader of that movement as well, whose mother happens to be the whip within Te Pāti Māori, who was recently demoted. I'm not saying there's any particular motivation related to that. Yes, things happen within parties, Neale, but what was different here was to see Te Pāti Māori's leaders coming out, promising a reset, communicating with members, and they had also been apologetic on behalf of an MP earlier in the Takuta Ferris statements, which he did not apologise for. This is a different front coming from the leadership in some ways, and does it indicate how worried they are about some of this?
I think so. I think they could see it unravelling, and one of the things that I think was concerning is, while every party does have internal ructions and it's nothing new, ultimately that needs to be resolved. Either the leadership gets replaced or the MP ultimately gets brought back into line or kicked out. And what's happened here is you've got Takuta Ferris has said, I stand by my comments, I'm not going to apologise, and then has started talking about how he has mana in his own electorate seat that sits above the leadership. And I think the problem here is, if you can't, how are you supposed to be in government if the leadership can't even guarantee the votes or the behaviour of their MPs?
But this is also a movement that respects kaupapa, and this again is part of the friction of doing politics within this particular parliamentary system.
And I get that, but you have to start where the world is, not as we'd like it to be. And the nature of parliamentary politics and the exercise of parliamentary power is you need to be able to guarantee votes.
That's Labour's issue as much as anyone else's. Te Pāti Māori could stay out of government, represent its people,
This is the challenge. So Chris Hipkins probably can't win with the Māori Party and probably can't win without them. And that's an impossible position for him to be in. And I guess what I would say for Te Pāti Māori, they've got a big reset coming they've talked about, the leadership. I think that's probably wise. It's a good chance to clear the decks and move forward. And I think if Te Pāti Māori believes its own rhetoric about the current government, that the government is bad for Māori, that it's beating up on Māori, that it's, indulging racism and all these things, if it truly believes that, then it has a moral obligation to do what's needed to be done to remove it from power. And if I was a National Party strategist, there are 3 things I'm relying on to retain power. 1 is the economy returning, 2 is Labour stuffing up its tax plans, and 3 is Te Pāti Māori making Labour an unwelcome proposition for swing voters. And so I think they actually have to, if they want to remove this government and they want their people not to be attacked, they actually need to find a way to make it so that the government can be changed. And right now, they're a barrier to that.
Brigitte, it's a critical juncture in the road for this party in some ways, isn't it, at the moment? As we said, they could practice politics their way. They're within Parliament, but absolutely respect the kaupapa that was being talked about there, not necessarily become part of a formal government arrangement or even a formal support arrangement. But to Neale's point, as things stand, that means the government that they are so critical of has the best chance of staying in power.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, they are equally, well, not say equally, they are also critical of many of the things that Labour stands for. They actively campaign against Labour, just most recently in the by-election, but also generally at the general election, about the fact that they don't believe that the Labour Party delivers for Māori anymore as well. So I don't think it's fair on Te Pāti Māori for them to have to make the concessions to do whatever needs to be done to come into government. They are being delivered by a particular group within our community. Those people choose to vote for Te Pāti Māori for a reason. And I think Hipkins has to realise that he either has to say Te Pāti Māori is not someone that we can work with because we're so far removed on policies, or he also has to compromise and front up to the electorate that this is what he's doing to get a change in government. And that's a valid way forward, but obviously the politics on that are very difficult because Te Pāti Māori are very unpopular with the swing voters that Hipkins needs to win back.
Yeah, look, inevitably it goes both ways and it will require a bit of give and take on both sides. I guess, to go to Brigitte's point, yes, Te Pāti Māori also, attacks Labour as being, racist and a creature of the colonialist Westminster establishment and all this stuff. I think any reasonable person looking at the last Labour government and its record on Māori and treaty issues and this current government, if you think there's no different, you're fooling yourself and you're fooling your supporters. I think it's obvious to anyone with eyes to see that if the Te Pāti Māori wants things to be better for Māori and wants to stop this government's agenda, they have to get rid of them, and that means working with Labour and the Greens and finding a way to be electable.
Look, it's a really interesting juncture. I note also that the Toitū Te Tiriti spokesperson Eru Kapakingi, of whom we were speaking earlier, has ruled out forming any other kind of party after distancing the movement from Te Pāti Māori just in the past week or so. But as we said, the sheer number of people who supported or who support that movement and are part of that movement, that will cause some concern to Te Pāti Māori. Very interesting to see how, after their new MP is sworn in this week, Wairene Kaipara, how this reset happens. Okay, the government's brought forward, I think, the job seeker change. Brigitte, look, again, we've got cost of living as the number one issue for voters in just about every survey I see. Electricity might have been last week seen as a missed opportunity to tell anybody that your prices are coming down anytime soon, right? What are they gaining out of bringing forward this move that says to anyone earning $65,000 or more with a young person aged, I think, 17 or 18 on the job seeker benefit, that now you're supporting them out of your income? Who are they pitching to with this?
Well, I think this goes back to what they were elected on, which is about making sure that there was targeted intervention at the right spaces to make the right long-term difference. And we know for 18 and 19-year-olds in particular, or anyone under 25 who's on the job seeker benefit, that means that they're basically being sentenced in some ways to a lifelong dependency on that job seeker benefit. It is, I think, the government's role to intervene and actually make sure that we don't allow young people to get onto that cycle. Without a doubt, that $65,000 is a tough, salary level or wage level, but I do think that it has to be tough to actually make that difference. And for me, if it was just this intervention, I think that would be too tough in the current economic circumstances. But the fact that they are doing the wraparound services, the additional interventions to support young people, indicates that there is actually the ability for some of those young people to actually see this as the motivation that they need or the incentive they need to get off to job seeker and into lifelong stable employment.
So just to be clear, the government's proposing to means test parents before their 18 or 19-year-old can get a benefit. I think I saw the Prime Minister saying businesses were lining up for young workers. I don't know. I know 20,000 people applied for a certain number of jobs at IKEA. What do you make of who they're pitching to with this and why?
Look, whenever unemployment starts to tick up, governments, particularly on the right, tend to get very concerned that young people and beneficiaries are getting lazy. People get thrown out of work because there aren't jobs, generally speaking. People generally want to work, and this policy does not create jobs, it just punishes those who can't find them. The idea that anyone can survive on $65,000 at all is amazing to me, let alone support an adult on that money, maybe more than one adult on that money. I think Christopher Luxon seems out of touch here. I don't think he has the first clue what it's like to be 18, to not have a dollar to your name, to not have skills, to not have networks.
We're talking the NEET group, as it said, though, not in employment, education or training, not just unemployed.
Yep, and people's lives are hard and complicated, I mean, many of us will know from our own lives or those around us that people have, strained relationships with family. They fall between the cracks. If you're 18, you are at your most precarious you've ever been. You are trying to find your way in the world, and you've got now a job market which is incredibly hostile to young people trying to enter it. And I just think this is performative cruelty to try and appeal to people to say, look, it's not that the government's failing on this, it's not that the government isn't getting the economy going, it's that young people are lazy. And I just think it is clearly political, and it's clearly aimed at transferring blame from themselves and their economic failure onto the people who are the victims of it.
All right. Look, these are challenging times. There's no question of that for any government, particularly on the fiscal front. I think there's a mega strike coming, with a very large number of people going on strike all at once. The cost of living remains high. At the same time, we'll just touch on this again, Brigitte, we did last week. The Treasury's projections looking forward show no easy fiscal path for future governments, talking about significant increases in the age of eligibility for super or big tax hikes or both. How much is this going to feature in the election campaign, or will they keep their focus short, do you think, to the short term?
I think it will affect the election campaign next year, because I don't think you'll see big spending promises from either party. I mean, the current government obviously has come in with a mandate in which to reduce public spending and reduce untargeted public spending. So they're going to continue that. But I also think for Labour, they're going to understand that fiscal envelope. Barbara Edmonds, I think, is a bit of a breath of fresh air on that. But also they know that many people are not supportive of the large sort of untargeted sort of wasteful spending that happened over the last, particularly 2 years of the last Labour government. So I think we're going to see a much tighter election next year, not a lot of that big spending promises, which is why I think the announcements from Labour about what they're going to do on tax are actually going to be the big defining difference between them.
This is the thing, these fiscal projections aren't new, but they seem to be getting worse every time they are released, and a lot of it's to do with the ageing demographic and fewer taxpayers to support a bigger retirement cohort. But I don't see radical proposals coming out of either side of politics on this, so will both sides keep the focus on the short term, do you think?
I don't think Labour will be supporting raising their age of eligibility to 72, as the Treasury now wants to.
Well, will they raise it at all?
No, and I hope they don't. They've suggested they won't. I think Labour's tax policy will be interesting in terms of how they pitch it, because rather than just being a scary new tax policy because Labour can't manage its money and needs to go back for more, they need to pitch it as these are things at risk under the current government. Your health system, your superannuation, your ability to retire in dignity, these are at risk if we carry on like this. And the only way we can afford to pay for it is if we tax capital gains the same way we tax minimum wage cleaners.
It's going to be more than a capital gains tax, honestly, Neale.
Yep.
And especially if it's a capital gains tax that excludes the family home. You know, it takes a long time for any significant income revenue to come from that.
And they'll need to probably wind back some of the subsidies for landlords this government's given. There'll be multiple things they can do, but I think this is where I think Labour has to start talking about hope, because every single thing we talk about and look at, life is getting harder and meaner for everyone at a time when we've never...
It kind of is.
Yeah, but at a time when actually we've never been wealthier as a society, apart from New Zealand, which has been shrinking the last couple of years. But we actually do need to start thinking, how do we provide security for everyone in retirement, in ill health, in their work.
Well,
and I think that's a platform that Labour can campaign on.
It's like coming back to where we started with the electricity market. Will tinkering do? Maybe that'll be the question for 2026 for both of them, informing their policies. Thank you very much. That is Neale Jones. Thanks also to Brigitte, Morten,